Whooping Crane Chronicles is a collection of stories to learn from, to ponder, and to celebrate. I'm Mike Forsberg, a conservation photographer from the Great Plains. I've spent the last 5 years, camera in hand, exploring the natural history of whooping cranes across the continent, meeting the people who love them, and discovering how these tall, magnificent, and rarest of cranes are navigating our 21st century world. This podcast elevates conservation stories and uplifts these birds to showcase their natural history and beauty in the hope of keeping these birds around for generations to come. Join me on the journey. Hi everyone, it is the week before Thanksgiving, and this morning we are in Rockport, Texas, on the Texas Gulf Coast, at the International Crane Foundation's offices, literally right across the street from the Rockport Municipal Airport, where from time to time you're going to be hearing, maybe you just heard it, planes doing touch and goes overhead. And you know, that's all right because we're talking about birds and flight and migrations, and whooping cranes are just now beginning to arrive from an epic 2,500 mile long fall migration from Wood Buffalo National Park to settle into their wintering grounds here at Aransas National Wildlife Refuge and surrounding lands. Today, we are joined by Dr. Liz Smith, good friend, and a longtime coastal conservation scientist based here, recently retired from the International Crane Foundation. So Liz, welcome to the program.
Thank you.
I met you over a decade ago, and I think it was when you were attending Spring Migration Festival on the Platte River in my backyard in Nebraska. And since that time, back in maybe, 2011 or something, you've done quite a bit for whooping cranes conservation down here in Texas. So before we jump in, can you give our listeners an introduction to yourself?
Okay, Sure. Well, when I started in 2011 with the International Crane Foundation, I was a whooping crane biologist. Something that I felt I was more than a biologist. Yeah. So over time, I was able to become the senior whooping crane scientist, which to me felt right. But I also, at the beginning, was director of the Texas program, but I was a staff of one, and I had a hard time controlling that staff.
I bet you did.
But as we grew, then I also envisioned this Gulf Coast program, including Louisiana. Reintroduction population into it. And then in 2018, I also became the North America Program Director, and that was covering both the eastern migratory population of whooping cranes and also sandhill crane work that was being conducted by our staff. But that was more easy because I had people that were already doing that, and I didn't need to learn sandhill cranes. Although I have, and I love them. Yeah. So, but that was really great because we really wanted to create a one North America program, and that was accomplished where we all worked together.
Yeah.
I'm a native Texan, and I was actually born on the furthest west you could be in El Paso, where there was very little water.
Yeah.
Okay. And I spent my kind of early years actually in the southwestern New Mexico, and in the Gila Wilderness area. That's where I kind of started learning about everything. And then my dad said, we're moving to the coast. And I was just super dismayed. And so we got here and I just couldn't believe it. You know, it was just amazing. It was just this treasure chest of new things, and he was a naturalist. And so we just started exploring.
How old were you at the time?
I was 9.
Roughly? 9,
yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
And siblings?
Yep, I had two sisters and myself and our grandmother who raised us as well. And so, yeah, we got here and we just started doing everything and going everywhere. And my dad was a teacher, but he was a boat captain in the summer. So I started deckhanding when I was 10 and learning to sail. And
wow, what did your dad teach?
he taught shop and art and history.
That's a pretty eclectic mix right there.
Yeah, and he actually he worked on a side of town that didn't have much of a budget, and kids didn't really have as much of a chance. And so he started getting money from people to build boats, and they learned to build boats and shop. And so they had a craft when they came out. So.
But he was from El Paso.
Well, he was actually from Michigan, so he was actually on the water.
Okay.
You know? Yeah.
Huh.
So that was a really great introduction, and that taught me a lot of skills, you know, mainly marine skills. And then, you know, as soon as I could start running boats myself as an amateur, I did that. And in the summer, deckhands out on fishing boats in the Gulf, and so that's what I was going to be, was a captain. Until I realized that maybe I needed to, you know, advance a little bit.
You can still be a captain.
So no, I'm getting pressure now that I'm retired. But anyway, and so, but I did, you know, also really love art.
Yeah.
And I couldn't decide. I went to junior college, and I flipped twice my majors, like once a semester. And finally my grandmother said, you know, I think you should be a scientist and do your art on the side.
Why'd she say that, you think?
Well, because my dad was an artist.
Saw how tough it was, right?
And so, you know, she said, you know, it's great to be creative, but you'll find ways. And I did immediately. I started taking biological illustration from a very well-known artist here, Dinah Bowman.
Cool. And
so, and I illustrated some papers, scientific papers for other scientists, and
so that was your bridge into science, was coming through the art side,
right?
And first as an illustrator of.
Yes.
So what were some of the illustrations you did? Do you remember?
Oh yes.
Those?
Oh my gosh. I mean, the very first one I did was a paper that was identifying a new polychaete. It was a marine worm, and to make that look really, you know, interesting, you know, get all the details of the little CD that were different and things like that. I did a lot of microscopic work, which is fascinating. And I was always very detailed work. In fact, I still am. That I'm trying to. And my dad was very expressionistic, and he was saying, "Let go." You know, that's a photograph. You know, you can.
Right.
And I just couldn't do it. And so now that's kind of where I'm going now, is more expressionistic art. Yeah.
No. See, I didn't know that. It's funny how you're friends with somebody for a long time, and then all of a sudden there's one more layer peeled away.
We kind of focused on a lot of issues in our conversations and challenges.
Yeah, I know. Yeah, for sure. Okay, so you've switched from art to science, and you're in college, and take us from there.
Okay. Well, I went to a small university in Corpus Christi. At that time, it's called Corpus Christi State University. Okay. And there were 3 professors in the biology department that were field oriented. And almost all the students were marine science students, but I, for some reason, wanted to follow a wildlife track. And so I actually took all the ologies. If you took 3 biology or ecology classes, you were out in field trips 6 weeks out of the semester.
Wow.
Going to deep into Mexico, along the coast, to southwestern deserts, and learning all the field techniques. And so that was just fantastic. And then I actually was able to get a National Science Foundation Minority Fellowship for my master's. And it needed to be groundbreaking information and techniques, so I worked on kangaroo rats. And they and this was a species that likes, you know, deserts, sand dunes, and here we have one that's on the coastal islands, the barrier islands, and also on the mainland. Right. And so I studied their genetics and their systematics. But in order to do that, I had to collect them. So that was my field, portion. And so, but it was good. But it's kind of hard to get a marine biology-oriented job after you've worked on kangaroo rats.
Right.
So I had a lot of competition from my fellow classmates that
Yeah.
were prepared for all of that. So I finally convinced a scientist at the Fish and Wildlife Service, then had a biological arm, to hire me, and I went out and collected seagrass samples in the Laguna Madre. And it worked out really well, and I learned a lot about private land ethics, working out there and getting landowner permission. And so I was actually out in the boat again, which is what I did well.
Right.
So a lot of rough days in Laguna Madre, collecting samples for 2 years, and with that I kept studying. And he gave me papers to read on, wetlands and seagrasses. But I actually taught for a year of that because they had my professor actually left, and there was no one to teach. And so I ended up teaching with a master's degree and no confidence in that, and talking to my fellow peers. But within that was really neat because we had to kind of change our ornithology class to a graduate level class. But my boss, Dr. West Tunnell, he said that, what would I do if I was going to have an advanced ornithology class? So I went through the book and I got to the behavior section. And I said, I want to teach avian behavioral ecology. And he said, that sounds really good. I was like, yeah, I wonder what that is. And so when I got to A&M, when I finally, when I got in for my PhD, once I convinced the professor I wanted to work for, who was Dr. Milt Weller, originally from Iowa State. And he's the waterfowl ecologist excellence. And so he had come down to study redhead ducks in the Laguna Madre, so he was interested in what I'd done with seagrasses. And so I was driven more towards a coastal vegetation dynamics focus, and with no animal in it, which was really like crazy because I wanted to work on animals. But he felt that I needed to understand the fabric, the tablecloth. And so I did a lot of field work, but a lot of modeling. And I was fortunate enough to get a fellowship from Wilder Wildlife Foundation. Yeah, it was cool.
So we've gone from like kangaroo rats to seagrass to landscapes.
Right.
And from community college to undergraduate work to master's to teaching to PhD.
Right.
All in a span of how many years, Liz?
Well, I got to Corpus Christi State University in like 1980, graduated in 86 with my master's, and then started my PhD in 90 and finished in 94. So yeah, wow. So it was a pretty long run, but a lot of great things in between that prepared me. I was very interested in being what I termed an ecosystem scientist. That's what I wanted to be.
I want to go back to two points to help our listeners, maybe the like me when I started working on the whooping crane project, coming from the middle of the country, 1,500 miles from any coast. Describe for us what barrier islands are first, and then maybe this larger landscape that we're in. How does it function in a nutshell?
Yeah, so barrier islands in the coastal system, they're relatively young. They're very dynamic. They're very subject to sea level changes. As sea level rises and lowers, their position changes, in location, but it looks similar. And so our coastline, being in the Gulf of Mexico, we have some currents that come around from, over from Florida west through by Louisiana and then to the Texas coast. And then we also have currents that come in over the Yucatan and the southern Gulf and up the Mexico coast. And so they converge pretty much, on this northwestern corner. And so that's why we have this longest, barrier island chain.
Yeah, I mean, we're sitting here talking in an office at the International Crane Foundation's Gulf Coast program, Texas program, and there's a map that's right next to us, and we're actually looking at the at the Gulf Coast and this thin barrier island chain that looks like a big, eyelash or fingernail, right? And it is long. And so you said it's the longest barrier?
It's the longest barrier island chain
in the
world.
In the world. So that's we hear about other island chains around the continent and around the world, but this is the longest, huh? Okay.
Yes, and it extends into Mexico.
Okay.
And there's a parallel, kind of a complementary system for the Laguna Madre and Tamaulipas.
Okay.
And they're, they basically, this is a system that's very young, probably 5,000 to 7,000 years old, and it's being fed by this sand bank that's moving in the near shores of the Gulf, and then bisected by passes that come from the rivers, the coastal rivers that empty into the bay systems and then out to the Gulf. So very rich and diverse, and yet very sensitive to change.
Right. Okay, good. Let's get back. You're working you're in your PhD program.
Right.
And you're working on these coastal systems.
Right.
Now what?
Yeah, so basically, I was the other thing about the Texas coast is it's in a very interesting geographic position and a climatic position, so that as you move from one end of the East Texas down to South Texas, we have this rainfall gradient that goes from 60 inches a year to less than 20.
So we're going 60 from the eastern, like Houston, let's say, inches down to
Brownsville.
Down to Brownsville at 20. Okay.
Yeah, and that's variable. It's a little bit more constant on the wetter end, but on our end, starting here at the mid-coast and south, there's a lot of more drought than wet in our cycles. So it either rains a lot or it doesn't rain at all. So the vegetation in the marshes adjust to that under normal conditions.
Right.
And so where I was studying the San Bernard National Wildlife Refuge.
Okay, so south of Houston and a little bit down coast, right?
It's not quite up to Galveston Bay.
Okay.
So turned out to be an area that actually went through a fairly significant change during my 3 years of collecting data. And so I modeled that. It turned out that I had a great big system model that had freshwater inflows and Gulf Pass inflows and all kinds of things. And there wasn't enough data to do something like that at that time. And so I ended up with a very simplistic model that worked very well, much to my relief, that just basically looked at salinity changes and water depth changes. So I was able to show how these plants changed along this elevation gradient. But as I looked at it and thought about what I'd seen already with sea level rise, I felt like that it could be a sea level rise model as well. And that's what I kind of kept clinging to was, this isn't enough. We need to do something that shows how things are going to change into the future.
So sea level rise, so this was in the late 90s?
Yeah, mid-90s.
Or mid-90s. And I remember in the mid-90s there was some discussion about sea level rise and climate change, but it was sort of tucked away, in more hidden academic corners.
Right.
I think a lot of people like you were probably out there waving your arms at the rest of the world, but nobody was paying attention at the time.
Right. Yeah, and it was something that we understood as locals.
How so? What does that mean?
Since I started out at being on the water in like 1966, I have a pretty broad database baseline.
Yeah, you do.
And so, and then of course my dad was very interested in all of that. So, but I noticed that there were places where we had areas you couldn't kayak that then you could over the years. And I also saw that flooding happening in more low-lying areas and people's houses being flooded. And so we have that going on with storm surges, but it's just inching up. And then along the Texas coast, we also have a lot of subsidence, which is the subsurface layers of old clay deposits from rivers being compacted, We also have oil and gas extraction that is causing the subsidence, and also water. So we have twice as high of a sea level rise rate for those two reasons than would be normal from just glacial, melting or whatever.
Right.
So it happened. You see it, and then as I was doing this elevational model going into the uplands, looking at that, I could say, I think this is going to be marsh in the future.
So when you say uplands, you were saying also inlands.
Inland,
right? Again, for those of us that don't live on the coast, right?
Yeah, and then as far as the barrier islands goes, as a hurricane hits the coast and it breaches a barrier island, it could deposit a lot of sand on the back side.
Sure.
But it erodes the front side. So if you have that balance going on, you have this shoreline retreat, but it should be expanding into the bay system.
Yeah.
So, so that was another thing, another kind of side of it that I wasn't able to model at that scale of I was just supposed to be explaining zonation. So,
but you couldn't help yourself, could you?
I couldn't. So that kind of segued into my next, my first job at the university that I had graduated from and where I wanted to live, which was now A&M Corpus Christi.
Okay.
There was a new Center for Coastal Studies that had been established, and I was able to get a position there as a research scientist instead of as a professor, and starting a program, habitat assessment and coastal planning, that I thought was important. It was brand new. So we wrote, coastal planning inventory documents, which the students worked on. They were like a menu. Like if you want to do a project and you have some money funding, where would you do this project?
Yeah.
So that was not at all what I had thought about, but it was really exciting. And for us along the Texas coast, seeing this obvious change in other coastal environments, that we really needed to make sure that we preserved this now, because change was coming and development was happening, and oftentimes by outside interests that didn't have that place-based. We want people that understand all of this as environmental consultants, and we want them in industry, and we want them in business. And so it wasn't that you were a pure, this is my view. It's that you had to have multiple views.
Yeah, but there's some threads here that go clear back to your childhood, right? Of having all these experiences growing up as a kid outside in nature, and then going into your early career as a student and having a lot of these place-based experiences out in the field and finding the value and the passion really in that, and now carrying it forward into an opportunity where you're the scientist and you're turning around and you're working with students that were just like you maybe,
right?
And not like you, but giving them these experiences out in the field, and being able to not just look at one thing, but look at multiple things across space and time that connect and interconnect with each other.
Exactly.
Right. How many students do you think you've had underneath your wing during that entire time?
Well, I ended up as an advisor and as a member probably 50, as an advisor 30 in 17 years, and it was always hands-on, real world teaching. And I see them everywhere. It's wonderful.
So you work with a lot of these same former students today?
Oh yeah, and they're the ones that were in the program when I first started are now leading these businesses and organizations and agencies.
It's pretty cool, Liz.
Yeah. It's great, because I feel good that knowing that they're taking charge of a difficult project, that they have that that ethic that they were instilled in them.
So you created this tremendous learning laboratory for all these people that are out there today that are working in places that they not only understand with their brain, but they love with their heart.
Yeah, you have to be passionate in this kind of work, because it has to drive you forward, and but you also have to have the tools that are unbiased and that are takes critical thinking, so that you can defend Yeah, and it's it's great to go out in the field, and first it's just hugs all around, because I'm proud of them and they're proud of themselves.
Yeah.
That was so much fun because we were all learning.
Yeah. All right, Liz, we've been with you through almost a couple decades of academia at this point, right?
Right.
Student, grad student, PhD,
right.
Scientists all working within at least 1 foot, firmly anchored in the academic community.
Yes.
Did you stay there?
Well, I loved it there.
Yeah.
And I felt like there was always something next that needed to happen. And, things change. And so I was looking to do something, along the coast that was important. The sea level rise, Texas has not been the first state to accept climate change by any means. But we knew, we needed to continue working on it to show that what we were doing was important at a broader scale. And so I talked to Tom Stain, who was the whooping crane coordinator for the U.S. on the recovery team and based out of Aransas National Wildlife Refuge, and whom I'd known forever. And he said, could you tell me what's going to happen with whooping crane habitat and sea level rise? And I said, sure. And I thought, here's my chance. I'm going to actually get out in the field and be able to document this change over several years, more decades, and also see how the animals are responding to that change. And it wasn't that way. It was a modeling exercise. And so I did a model on that. I had a graduate student that wasn't interested in the sea level part, in the coastal wetlands part, but in what's happening with the live oak red bay community of the uplands. How much of that are we going to lose with sea level rise? So I thought, that's pretty cool. We can cover the whole area that way. And so I presented that paper at a conference. And the GIS guy from ICF was there. And he said, I think my boss would like to hear about your study. And so he connected me with Dr. Rich Belfast, the CEO and president. And he contacted me and said they wanted to start a project, a program down here. And did I have anybody that I thought might fit? It's a former student. And so I said, I'm sure I do. I know I can find somebody for you. And he started telling me all about it, and I'm taking notes, and pretty soon I can't even breathe. I'm just like, oh my God, this is amazing.
Yeah.
And the other names are slowing down coming in, and I'm just like, finally, I said, Rich, the heck with these other people. I said, I think I'd like to apply. And there was a long pause, and he was like, oh my goodness, I'm gonna have to go back to the board on this one because we weren't expecting this, but sure. And so I talked to my husband about it, and he said, you're so excited. We need to consider this. Yeah. And so, and it was I guess it was kind of like another challenge. And it was from the ground up. And so 6 months later, I was working for the Crane Foundation, and my last student was finishing up, and so she helped with the new projects and actually went on to earn her own PhD on whooping cranes.
Wow.
And I had an office in the Fish and Wildlife Service, Ecological Services in Corpus Christi, which was awesome. We were really looking at, the population stability, being affected by habitat degradation from development and from sea level rise, or shootings or power line strikes. All of that was really, really high on the list. But the other things like the subtle invasion of black mangrove, which is a tropical brush species, was replacing the marsh that the birds traditionally used. And then the crabs. Blue crabs are something that they depend upon a lot and should be very abundant in a healthy system, that they were declining. And so what could be done about that? And where do we save habitat now and into the future?
Let's shift gears here for a minute because I want to lay a base for these big white birds down here in Texas. I want to start with the question that's personal to you. When was the first time that you saw, do you remember the first time that you saw whooping crane?
Yes. I think everybody should and must. But it was the first year that we moved here from the Southwest.
When you were still a child.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yep. And I remember, that was my, as I mentioned, my dad was a school teacher.
Yeah.
And they don't make a lot of money. And my parents, my grandmother and him, decided that we needed to go see this, this rare bird.
Mm-hmm.
And so we went on the whooping crane, which was a big, tour boat, like 50-foot long tour boat, and it was pink and white. I think more about rosette spoonbills and whooping cranes, and so we went out from Lamar and went around Blackjack Peninsula and up the Intercoastal to look for these birds. And the captain of the boat was on a microphone, and his name was Captain Brownie. And he was just, had all this information, and it was so fascinating. And when we finally saw the cranes, they were in the back part of the marsh, which you and I would now know that about this time, the tide is high, and they're in the back, more closer to the uplands. Mm-hmm. But they were just little white specks, and we didn't have high-powered, scopes or anything back then. But my dad had some humongous, binoculars that you had to, two of us hold each side practically.
Right. Yeah.
And so, but just watching them and hearing about them and the fact that they had declined so precipitously, and there were only 43 that were there.
Man, so
in 65, 66.
Yeah.
And they were just widespread across the landscape. You would see like 2, and then you would see maybe 3. And Captain Brownie explained they needed all of this because there had been so much research done by Robert Porter Allen and others up to that point that indicated that they needed a lot of habitat.
So mid-60s, you're looking at a couple of the last 40 or so, and back in the 1940s was their all-time low.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
At around 20 or so.
Right.
And then in between, in the 50s, they found where these birds were nesting because that had been lost to generations. These birds were showing up here in the wintertime, but they didn't know where they were coming from. They were, traditionally, historically, tallgrass prairie marsh birds was their core nesting range in places like Iowa and southern Minnesota and the Dakotas, and just basically a prairie pothole region. So, gosh, that you were only about 10, 12 years removed from, at that time of being on that boat, the whooping crane, looking at those birds out on the marsh from science even knowing where these birds were nesting. So that's pretty remarkable. What's, so when I came down here a couple days ago to Texas from Nebraska, we drove straight south basically from central Nebraska, and we were following along, what I've liked to call now the Whooper Highway, because, and I know that right now here in mid-November, whooping cranes are migrating from Wood Buffalo National Park out of their nesting grounds down here to the Texas Gulf Coast. And I was always thinking, driving down Highway 81 or Interstate 35, that if you look up, you may just see a big white bird. So these birds now are dropping out of the sky, coming into these coastal habitats. Why are these birds here? What is it that they need? When do they come? How long do they stay?
Yeah.
And when do they leave?
Yeah.
But Cliff's notes on the natural history.
Sure. Well, we're part of the Gulf Coast Prairies and Marshes ecoregion, which is the end of the prairie flyway and everything.
Yeah.
But that extends from the little bit of Louisiana all the way into Tamaulipas in Mexico. So we know that they probably occurred all the way along the coast. But
for a several 100-mile stretch, right, historically.
Yeah. And they're pretty resourceful. They've already come 2,500 miles through what wasn't coastal marsh.
Right.
But I think that, as they were hunted and what was happening in the entire flyway, maybe this was a refuge, but they had to get to here.
Yeah.
And so the Aransas Wildlife Refuge was actually dedicated in 1937 for the purpose of waterfowl. but everyone knew there were whooping cranes there. And so I think that back before the intercoastal waterway cut through and commerce and recreational traffic started happening in there, it had to have been just one of the most beautiful places on the coast. So I just feel like it was a refugia for them, and I feel like that this area, that the animals that need a lot of space and isolation and the people that need the same agreed on that.
Yeah.
And could coexist.
Yeah. So when the whooping cranes are showing up here now in November, early December, take us through the daily life of these birds.
Yeah. It's, they do a lot of milling around. The tides are usually really high, which changes things.
King tides, right?
Yeah, they're basically high in October, depending on when the fronts are coming across the continent that are bringing these birds down. But that deposits all this, food, primarily crabs, into these little ponds, and then that's when they settle in. That's when they settle down. Territorial disputes begin the more birds that come in, which is an amazing spectacle to observe from afar, as these birds literally are just going after each other, trying to claim what they believe is theirs. And then things start to settle down, and midwinter they're more predictable about where they are, and then our tides go down very low, and so that's usually January, February. But then they move into other kind of habitats they don't usually see them in, and that's exposed seagrass meadows, oyster reefs, sandy flats, and they start eating a diversity of species that makes up their diet of clams and mussels and small crabs and fish and shrimp that are caught in that seagrass. And so that's really, really cool time to see them out in the bays.
You had a great quote in a question and answer at the Yampa Valley Crane Festival that you and I were at in Steamboat Springs, Colorado, a couple months ago, and somebody asked you what they eat, whooping cranes eat, and you said they eat what's in front of them.
Yes.
Because I know that typically, if you read the literature that's out there for the public, and you've only got so much to say, you've got a few words to say what their diet is. Usually, the lead is blue crabs and wolfberry, right? As the two key food sources. And that is true, but it's a lot more diverse than that.
Oh yes, that this bird, it's 5 feet tall. It takes a lot of energy to move, and they're strong flyers, but they have to mobilize themselves. They have to get off the ground, and then the wind currents are very strong. That's sustained energy, and so they are opportunistic.
Yeah.
So if they find something that's really, really nutritious, they stay with it. But they'll eat snakes. There's a Gulf salt marsh snake that we have that actually has candidate species because they're kind of rare, and the whooping crane eats them because they can. And the thing about the blue crabs, the fact that blue crabs are declining across their entire range is very concerning.
Why are they declining?
Well, not really sure. There's some things like it could actually be changes in ocean chemistry. The pH is changing how they metabolize carbohydrates and to make calcium carbonate for their shells. We didn't study pH and that kind of level of change, but we're certainly seeing that change. But I think that the other thing is just habitat loss of what they utilize if we develop the coastal marshes, whether that's residential or industrial. We have ghost crabbing, we call it. There's these crab traps that we use. If they're abandoned or lost, they continue to collect crabs and other species, and those crabs die.
So they're left out there in the bays, and if they're not collected, they just become these death traps, basically.
Yes.
Because nobody comes and harvests them. They just
collect
and collect and collect.
Yeah. And so there's been an effort for that to actually go. They closed the fishery for a set period of time in February, and then volunteers go out and find all the crab traps there. Even if it has a tag on it, it is considered abandoned during that period.
I see.
And so that's a small effort, but a big effort.
Yeah.
And it mobilizes us.
Yeah.
But even temperature, the water temperature in the bays, we're having these intense freezes in areas that we never expected here.
Yeah.
And that can decimate the population. But they should be able to rebound. So it could also be chemicals.
Yeah.
Just legacy chemicals from times when we were not regulating like we should have, to current spills.
I mean, we're sitting in perhaps one of the largest industrial petrochemical complexes in the world.
Yes.
Here along the Texas Gulf Coast, all the way to Louisiana. And it struck me yesterday as we were driving along the coast coming here. I mean,
it's crazy.
It's crazy. I mean, there's us everywhere. And you look off the coast and you see boats and platforms and all this, and this is our world today.
Yes.
I mean, we're not going to go back to what it once was 150 years ago.
Right.
We're just not.
It's not going to happen.
Right. So you think then about back to these whooping cranes. You talked about early on when they're arriving now in November, early December, they're reestablishing, jockeying for position with territories and such, and these birds need 300 to 500 acres maybe or so as a territory for established pairs anyway. I know there's a lot of movement and all this all around, but these are like the polar bears of the bird world. They need a lot of space, right? And that space is increasingly limited as these birds continue to be albeit somewhat tenuous conservation success story, and their numbers continue to climb, which still is not very many. We have 540 maybe in this last truly wild, migrating, self-sustaining flock. But the pressures of development continue, and sea level rise continues. Established Aransas National Wildlife Refuge in 1937, but it's only so big.
Right.
What's next for these birds?
Yeah. Well,
where do they go?
I think looking at this a lot from a spatial standpoint, looking at the landscape and seeing change happening. It's reality. When I look at all the different potential overlaps and potential conflicts, I see that we still have a lot of area left. And a lot of this is in some very, very large private land holdings. Texas-wide, 95% is privately owned, and along the coast, 80%. And the fact that these birds are adapting to wet agriculture, to rice, and to crawfish farms, and they are looking at it as in their own eyes as a food source and a roosting area. As industry continues to expand and increase, we have to look at everyone as a partner. So I feel like education is huge. I think that the main thing is that being able to convey that this is important for people as well, for us to maintain a really healthy environment and a place where we would want to raise our kids. And then also have that environment that they get experiences, that I think are important, being stewards, being responsible for, other living beings.
So healthy grasslands, healthy wetlands, it's not just healthy for cranes, it's healthy for us too, right?
Yeah.
So you said in Texas, 95% under private ownership. Where I come from in Nebraska, it's 97%. Most of the Great Plains states lean real hard on private lands, and you get up into Alberta and Saskatchewan. A lot of it's in agriculture, so a lot of it's the same.
Yeah.
So when I look at the whooping cranes and their future, these, and I hate to say private ownership, because my own personal philosophy was just getting off the rails a bit. It's not about owning it, but holding it. So I say land holding rather than land owning. But regardless of that, the future of these birds, a lot of times in a lot of these geographies that they migrate through and that they winter on, is really in our hands. It's up to us and those that are in these private lands. So when you make an approach, I mean, you've worked for ICF leading this program for many years, and you've described in the past something switched for you in your approach when you're talking to people about their land and their whooping crane habitats that they have.
Yes. Yeah, I mean, I think that, first of all, I really appreciate your land holdings approach, because I do really feel that we are, temporary, we're all temporary here, but the responsibility of holding land is really what it is about. When I first started out, I was thinking that, as cranes expanded in their landscape, how are people going to deal with that? It's an endangered species. I think we're getting over that as being a problem.
Endangered species being a problem, meaning
that they would be limited in what they did with their land. And so I think that we're out on the landscape, and we're, ensuring that people understand that that's not the case unless it's a deliberate act. But we went out, and I thought, well, it'd be really great to talk to all the different, the landowners that are in the current range. And a lot of them I knew and had known a long time. And so it was fun. And we were just going to do a little brochure of like, what can you do if you have whooping cranes, and minimize disturbance or threats, things like this. And so I asked one of the land managers that manages land that's very important for whooping cranes, what have you done different since you have whooping cranes? And he paused for probably longer than I was comfortable with. And then he looked me in the eye and he says, I believe we have whooping cranes because of how we manage the land. And it really floored me, because I had come in with the approach that, we're going to have to talk now that you have land, and I guess I'm the one that's going to, be able to help you figure this out. And they had it figured out.
Yeah.
And it changed everything for me, because I think that when you're connected to the land, especially if you've grown up there and it's a heritage situation, that you have a lot more insight than someone who is visiting.
Al and Diane Johnson have a pretty important land holding that have cranes on it. Being with Al and Diane over the years, the joy that comes when they're talking about their birds, the pride that comes talking about their birds, is something that you cannot legislate. It has nothing to do with policy or politics or anything else. It feels like, to me, it's part of who they are and of what defines them. Kevin and Lori Sims, who guide whooping crane tours and fishing trips and other sorts of things in their business, and the passion that they have in their voices about these birds and the intimate connections that they've had with the experiences, just to me, that almost like they stack up these experiences like books on a bookshelf in their minds that they can go and retrieve and read and recall at any time for so many different people, and the lives that they touch is remarkable. Every time that I get a little pessimistic or sullen about the world or these birds and the challenges that they face, it always comes back to me that the people that care about these birds really love them and will fight for them. And these birds themselves are more resilient than we think. There seems to be a fighting spirit there amongst both. I was in Saskatchewan in fall of 2021 in October, and I spent almost 3 weeks mostly in blinds photographing whooping cranes that had just come out of Wood Buffalo National Park. So they had left their nesting grounds and they had flown over the boreal forests and were just crossing the ag line and getting into the northern Great Plains and prairie potholes with a lot of agricultural landscape around it, and this geography where a lot of them come and gather to rest and refuel before the rest of their journey coming down here to Texas. And in these blinds that I was in, there were some nights where I was looking at 100 whooping cranes or more on a roost in front of me. And some of those, maybe 10% or less, were these little cinnamon colored young that were maybe 3.5 months old at that point, knowing that they were going to be learning that entire migration route and everything else they need to survive with mom and dad, hopefully making it down here to Texas, a month and a half later. And it was such a special moment for me to be in that place at that time, because I knew that I was looking out at a flock of birds and counting more in a single flock than had been on this planet, from the late 1900s up until the 1940s when they hit the low point. Can you take us from that low point, when here in your home now, in the backyard, there were only roughly 20 birds and nobody knew where they even nested or came from? Can you take us from then to now?
Sure. When I look at that growth, curve, that population curve, it's just amazing to me that they didn't disappear at those low points.
Yeah.
Because anything could have happened.
Yeah.
Maybe they could have actually all landed in the same place and were hunted.
Yeah.
But at the same time, I look at species that never intended to fluctuate in population. They're long-lived. They're able to replace themselves, so to speak, over their lifetime and maintain a population. But to grow a population is very difficult for this type of selection.
Yeah.
And so it brings to mind that every one of them is important. So looking at them now and envisioning what you saw, to me, is just amazing, because we don't even see that here. They're spread out over such a pretty extensive area. And so, it gives me a lot of hope, of course, and especially, that there's so many young. But throughout that period from the 40s, and when I saw them at 1966, that's not much of an increase.
Yeah.
And even when I started at the Crane Foundation, they had not broken 300 in 2011. So it seemed really tenuous. And then as those birds slowly matured and became part of the reproducing population, we're seeing this increase yearly. And so it looks really heartening.
It's like a 4% increase or something right now.
Yeah,
right?
and that's based on your latest number.
Right.
So I think that we look at that graph and we think, wow, once we got to 430, I'd worked on in the whooping crane world. I thought, this is 10 times what I saw. And of course, I still hadn't seen them, and even back then I hadn't. But the graph itself gives hope. The question there is not where will it stabilize, but what can we support it? And so them being wetland dependent birds is really key here. And the fact that it's not just the wintering range that we have to conserve, it's the breeding areas, of course, but the migration route, which is something that to me is such a big challenge. Seeing that there are key areas along the migration that's really key to these congregations. So that to me needs to be a story to be told, because the public doesn't hear that part,
Right.
Even when it's published in science. So it's up to us to convey that. So I think looking at the totality, the whole picture, is key. And then maybe managing it at a scale that you can work on. Like I've always been comfortable in the wintering grounds, but knowing that that we're all working on the whole flyway.
Well, the Into Whooperland book just came out a couple months ago, and a large part of that book, from my standpoint when I started it, was to try to elevate the middle. The middle geography between the nesting grounds and the wintering grounds, which each have their challenges and each have their unique stories, but the story that has not often been told is that great middle, because it's hard, because A, there's very few birds, you know, and then B, it's a long way. And it's flying through a landscape that in a lot of cases for a lot of people is considered flyover country, and there's not much there anyway of significance to tell a story about, which is, you know, completely untrue, but that's the perception, you know. So, I mean, as we've been talking here, our listeners may have heard low rumbles once in a while during our conversation. We're sitting right next to the Rockport Municipal Airport, and I mean literally right next to it, just across the road. And in 2022, my friend Chris Boyer and I, there they go, there's a plane, pilot from Montana, and then friend Jeff Dale in his pickup truck, we traveled the Whooper Highway north. We started on April 7th in 2022, and we got up to Wood Buffalo National Park, I think it was April 24th or somewhere in there. It's 18 days total, and the vast majority of that travel was proverbially traveling with these birds on migration through the heart of the Great Plains. And the thing that struck me more than anything was just how little habitat there really is for them. Now they're good at finding the habitat that they need at the time that they need it, but every day when they started, just like every day when we started, we didn't know if we were going to fly that day. We didn't know how far we were going to go. We didn't know where we were going to get fuel. We didn't know where we were going to eat. We didn't know where we were going to sleep that night. And that is the bulk of that trip for those birds. And so every rung on that migratory ladder of habitats, whether or not it's a river or an upstream end of a reservoir or a pothole wetland or a playa basin, every small conservation program that's embedded in the Farm Bill or anything else, all of that stuff matters to these birds. And I think because people like Robert Porter Allen in the 50s and the Audubon Society, you know, began a campaign to move the story of these birds, not just about the nest and not just about the wintering grounds, but move that story into the middle of the country was important. The Endangered Species Act gave some weight to it because, like you said, you sometimes have to bring the hammer. You sometimes have to fight and stand up. And because of people like you and others that have just been out beating the drum every day in the places that you care for and that you love. I mean, that, to me, along with a great legacy of conservation laws in this country, education that continues, I think all of those things together has helped this ramp over time. But what you said about our capacity to support that growth on the land is, that, to me, that's everything, and it all starts with that simple word, care.
Yeah. We are all responsible.
Yeah, so pretty soon those numbers, the updated numbers, are going to come out, I think, again from last year to this year, to see how many we have in the wood buffalo to Aransas flock, how many we have in captivity, you know, how many are in Louisiana and Wisconsin. So I hope that graph that you kept referring to continues to rise upward.
I agree. And you know, over the years as I've worked on the birds, I had to continue my X and Y axis.
Yeah.
Years and then numbers, and that's always been good. And I think that, you know, the growth of the species is, you know, at some point will level off. It normally does.
Yeah, right.
But I think we always need to afford protection, because that's not the near future. So protection is important. Yeah. They'll do the rest. They're doing their part. We're not helping them reproduce otherwise, other than just giving them healthy habitats in their whole range.
Take your science hat off for a minute. Take your International Crane Foundation career aside for a moment and all this other stuff, and just let's get into the core for a minute. What do these birds mean for you personally and who you are as Liz?
Well, I think you know, everybody that I've worked with, every landowner, every agency employee, every NGO, you know, anybody, friends, whenever you talk about whooping cranes, there's this kind of awe and reverence. The story itself is part of it, but the fact that they probably never were very numerous, and why, and that real intimate connection to a wild nature is what I think we feel, and yet still have this stewardship. It's always important to understand that you don't have to talk about it. It's a feeling, and it's a felt, shared experience. It's amazing to be on a ecotourism boat with 30 people, and maybe half of them don't even really want to be there. They're with their significant other.
Right.
And they brought their book, and and for them to be just staring, out the lower window, and at these birds, and just in a zone. I think they have that persona.
Yeah.
Their real tenderness with their young. We relate to that.
Yeah.
That they're just spending all this time, a year of their life, training this bird and then releasing it.
Yeah.
And saying, you're on your own.
Yeah.
And so we it's hard not to anthropomorphize them. It's hard not to interpret what we think they're doing from a human side, but from an animal side, which we also are, I think we can.
Yeah.
So that's where I think the joy that we all have sharing all of this is that we feel that animalism and human, and how does it fit together, and we're the key to that. So
yeah, you always say great things, Liz. That was
a little emotional for me.
No, there's stuff that you can't put into words, that you can't explain, but you did a good job there. Here's another thing you may not be able to put into words, but we're sitting in the International Crane Foundation's Texas Program Office, or what's it called now?
Gulf Coast now.
The Gulf Coast Program Office, and you have officially retired, and as my grandpa would say, retired, tired, and working probably. You're not just sitting out on the back patio drinking a beer and watching the sunrise every day, which I hope you're not drinking a beer and watching the sunrise.
It hasn't come to that.
Back in college. But we're here in Carter Crouch's office, who's the new you here. He runs the program now, and the people that are here on his team are all younger in their careers, right?
Right.
How does that make you feel, seeing this next generation carry the torch?
Well, it's always good that in this kind of world that we work in and live in, that there's a lot of us that feel very similarly. I think that at some point you start allowing some wisdom, cynicism, whatever that comes up and goes, no, not again.
Yeah.
We've been through this before, and I just don't know. And yet that it needs to continue. And it wasn't for me that I was done or anything. It's just that I felt like that there's new blood and determination and everything that you want to have intermixed into the plan, the big plan. And so the team that's taking care of all of this now, when I met Carter, I was just like, whoa. I think this guy needs to do this. Certainly an excellent scientist, and a lot of determination to make a difference, and willingness to learn something totally new and different and challenging, but really great integrity. And so you want that's what you see in people.
Yeah.
Is this kind of work is not easy, but if you are able to come from deep inside and say, I want to be able to say I did something good, it makes it really easy.
Yeah.
The great thing, now is me seeing people, continuing to interact with people as a volunteer, that they just really embrace the new team, which is now over 2 years old.
Right. Yeah.
So they're not really new, and they've taken it to. We had a good plan, And that plan has continued to be implemented, and they've taken it to, it seems to me, a faster pace. But I'm watching from the outside.
Yeah.
I'm sure to Carter and the team, it seems like they're just plodding along, but they're not.
Yeah.
So it's good for me,
Yeah.
and I'm really proud of it.
Good. And you get to do more art.
Yes.
Now you
Yes.
get to lean back into that really creative side of you that has been welling up, I know, for many, many years. And you've had outlets. I mean, you're a fine photographer. I love seeing your photographs, but I also know that you are a fine painter, and you've started to get the brush and the canvas back out
Right.
again. And
Right.
so, what was the last piece that you painted?
Oh, it had to be a whooping crane.
Yeah.
Well, it's funny. I actually have started some different media, and the idea is for me to not have an end in mind, not to have a goal.
Mm-hmm.
If I had taken this path, early,
Yeah.
it would have been I needed to be a successful artist and make a living at it. I needed to understand, how to market my work, and that's not it now. It's to really just get back to reconnecting and connecting with people like that. And we have a very amazing artistic community here in the Rockport area and beyond, and I feel like that we can make a difference in that realm, as strong a difference as we can in science.
Mm-hmm.
So I'd like to be a part of that, not lead it,
Right.
but yeah, I laughed when you asked me what last thing I've been doing. It's everything. I feel like that at some point I would like to do a mural with everything in it and
Yeah.
go big,
Yeah.
and that might be in my own house. Really doesn't matter. But yeah, so it's and to have the time to do that. Art is an immersion,
Yeah.
and so releasing myself from things that are scheduled
Yeah.
sounds unbelievably fantastic.
It sounds like you're doing it.
Yeah,
So,
it's been good.
final question. If you had one thing to say to your fellow Texans about these birds, what would you say?
I think I would have to say that we have a responsibility, that they were likely here before any of us were, along some shoreline, and that shoreline was amazing in its diversity and its support to all the natural world. And so we just have to continue to think about that we live in a natural world, and how do we keep good parts of that going, and make sure that people are in that world too, so that they can continue the legacy.
That's perfect. Yeah. Liz, thanks for chatting today. We
Sure.
talk a lot anyway, but I've learned a lot about you today. Layers, I guess, that I didn't know before. And thank you for all the work that you do. And thank you for the person that you are. And I'm sure that the cranes thank you too. So,
Well,
appreciate
you're welcome.
you.
Yes.
Next, we will hear from other landholders that share their daily lives with whooping cranes. And I can't wait. These are the Whooping Crane Chronicles. Stay tuned.